our very special episode of as based on popular demand of having part two to our earlier conversation of code switching being POC in the corporate world. But before we get started, for those that may or may not know us, we'll go ahead and do introductions. I am Dana. I am a cosplay event and staff con photographer. You may have seen my photography with MomoCon, DragonCon, Anime Week in Atlanta, and DC Comics. I'm also a voice actor, event planner, and a whole lot more. And now I will hand it over to my lovely co-host and the founder of the Moana Nui Podcast, the lovely Moana.
Aloha mai kako, everyone. Welcome, good evening, and we are so excited to have you all tuning in to this week's episode and panel on code switching. As Dana mentioned, this is something that was really enjoyed by our listeners last month, and we kind of just barely scratched the surface on this particular topic. And so we thought it would be great to bring our panel back, and they've all graciously, agreed to come on and be a part of our platform and help us unpack this topic that is full of nuance and complexities. What we want to do this time around is be open to questions from the audience as well. So as you're sitting there listening, please feel free to chime in the comments if you have questions or comments, and things to the conversation. We welcome those as well. And I just
Exactly.
realized I did not introduce myself, but as Dana said, I founded the podcast, and I'm really honored to be able to build this community and surface issues that need to be, talked about and enact change in these areas. So whether it's through my comic book series, The Wild Card Chronicles, where we bring out diverse superheroes and stories that are based on the history and cultures of our people, or the children's book Adventures of Nakoa and Nohea, and the work that we do here at the Burning Spirit LLC. We are really just honored, as I said, to bring this panel tonight. So, Bar Fox was supposed to be our moderator tonight, but he had family commitment, and we're all about family first. So, Dana is stepping in tonight as our moderator, and I will hand things over to her, and she will take it away.
Awesome. Well, now we're going to bring our guests up to the front um, so we can start our conversation from where everybody left off. But last time I was behind the scenes, but this time I'm in the front of the scenes, so I get to interact with you all today. Uh, Thank you again for joining us. Latoya isn't with us yet, but hopefully she'll be joining us shortly. But of course, we want to make sure we have plenty of time for this conversation and dialogue. So I am just going to dive right on in. So, our first question, of course, for those that are still kind of new to the concept of code switching is more than just within language or the way one talks. It is also adjustments in the way one walks, dress, and more to allow people of color, Pacific Islanders, African diasporan, indigenous people, and Asian Americans to survive in the culture and workplace. For any of you that have experienced code switching, when has code switching crossed the line from normal to detrimental for you in your experience, and how did you deal with it?
I guess I can go first if no one else is going to jump in. Hello, everyone. Again, thank you, Dana Moana, for having us here again. I didn't know what it was called when I did it, first of all. So the term wasn't relevant to me until much later when I think the news picked it up with Obama and the way he was acting and talking towards some athletes. And I can't remember if they were Olympic athletes or what they were. But for me, I guess, having been raised in areas, when I first came to this country, and most of the other panelists know this, I was brought to Ames, Iowa. So there was like no diversity. It was all white. And then from there, we moved to Roanoke, Virginia. And you want to talk about somewhat of a 180, it was like black and white. And I was stuck in the middle. I had no, there were no Asians that I interacted with or understood or embraced any Asian cultural anything. So my two best friends, one was black and one was white. And one was very, I would have to say, redneck, and then, of course, my African-American friend, he was much more urban, and it was just, I didn't know how to gravitate. And I felt like growing up in Southern Virginia, I started gravitating more to my black friends and being much more, in the way that I talked, the way that I dressed, the way that I interacted. And so that was in my childhood, but it didn't really take until I got into my first job. I started working at 15 and 6 months selling Cutco knives door to door. So you've got a guy who's Asian, right? And he comes up to let's say a white family, and I'm selling Cutco knives, but my speaking style and my interaction style was definitely more, quote, urban because of the people that I interacted with. So, and again, I wasn't doing this like, oh, I got to act this way, or it just, and then I realized I was doing better sales. And this is, you got to remember, I'm a 16 to 17-year-old kid, and I'm doing better in the black neighborhoods than I am in the white neighborhoods selling knives. And I'm like wondering, why is that? And then I made the realization, it's the way that I'm presenting myself, right? Again, the way that I dressed, the way that I acted. And so I realized I had to sort of switch or sort of tone down what is inherently what I've been sort of raised in, right? Because I wasn't raised Asian, I wasn't raised white, and I don't want to say I was raised black, but I was involved or interacting more with the black community. And thus, so I had to sort of, curtail, if that's a better word for it, how I presented myself to the white customers. And then I noticed something. Oh, they're buying from me, And as much as it pained me, and again, I was only 16, 17, it didn't click like, oh, am I acting more white or I'm acting more black? That didn't really click. It was just because I learned in sales, and first of all, I'm not an extrovert. I'm really an INFJ, and I hate these Myers-Briggs terms, but I'm more introverted. But I learned to be extroverted because you've got to sell, you got to eat, right? So I was like, I need to learn how to sell. And I think that's what I looked at it in that perspective, that it was sales more than code switching, which I didn't realize until much later that it was really code switching. So I guess that would be the negative, because a lot of times I think a lot of youth today, like I look at my nieces and nephews, some of them are half black, half Korean, and I'm wondering if they're trying to figure out their identities as well. And I think that might be again, I don't want to call it a negative, but that might be the hole that they're trying to sort of, dig out from. That can be a negative. So I hope that answers your question, Dana.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else had any experiences of when code switching went from normal to detrimental for yourself in an experience, and how did you deal with it?
Good day, everybody. For me, Dejan Sneed here, and I try to think of code switching in that sense of, again, maybe not being your authentic self. Whether obviously at this point, I felt like in an intentional sense. I try to think of a retreat that I got invited to, a corporate retreat. It was a golf outing, and I didn't golf at all, but it was the thing of being invited for a leadership program where I was the only person of color. It was definitely a difference of ageism and some other points of trying to figure out a way to make a connection when there was like a definite age and generation gap between myself and management. And just in the simple sense, because I wasn't a good golfer, I was trying to involve myself in their conversations. And I realized that I wasn't talking about anything that I was more interested in. I tried to be, I realized I was trying to, air quotes, speak properly around them. It was everything was so measured. And I just realized, all I'm trying to do is make them comfortable, right? It wasn't anything about me bringing anything of the value of why I got invited to come out there. All of that was left back in my hotel room. Right? My thing here was just, almost, it was just pretty much a stripped down version of myself. And I had one manager after the event, kind of come to me, and I kind of recall him saying, like, they were saying like all the things that they wanted you to talk about. You didn't say anything. Like, you're real quiet on this event, and like, do you want to be in this position? It ended up being like a realization, like the things I think they probably expected from me that I was intentionally trying to take away, thinking that I didn't want to mess things up, or even worst case, mess things up for the next person of color that has to stand in this space. And so I think that was like a weight I was very cognizant of being like one of the very first to get invited to this manager's program, was that it wasn't just myself that I was representing. That I feel like that's something common among people of color that get put in these circumstances, that you're the example, you're the prototype, and or you're the one, and whatever happens here, we're going to judge the next 10 of you the same way, right? And you're being typecast, you're being stereotyped. And again, it just doesn't allow you in a lot of cases to form and function the way that I think you normally be able to. So I think the long and short of it, kind of as the story is, I ended up getting in the program, but I burned out of it pretty quickly and transitioned to another job. It was, I think I just put myself in a position that I was not going to be able to kind of keep up that charade of who they thought I should have been, and it just never was. It never was the same. After that particular point. But I think that's like an example of an opportunity that, because of code switching, or again, I think my presumption of needing to code switch, that ended up just in the main circumstance. It ended up not working well. But I think for me, it was a good eye-opening experience, and I can't really think of any more outside of that.
Got you. Okay. Now, of course, we brought out about the, negative portions of code switching. And a lot of times, people kind of connect code switching to inferiority complex that may develop within people of color because we have to meet a certain standard. How much code switching is recognized, do you feel, as part of the inferiority complex, and how much of it is education versus general ignorance? And is mainstream expectations of coming up or success play a part into it also?
Okay, I was going to wait to see if somebody else wanted to jump in on that, but having come from the film and video world, I definitely feel like I remember questioning, and this is because of where I was raised, when the Huxtables came on TV. I was like, wait a minute, that doesn't seem like my friend's family or the people that I engage in. I was just like, really? There's families, and even for someone who's our economic status, we weren't rich. My parents weren't rich. My father was an engineer, and it just like, wow, it sort of like distorted my view of families, especially from a much more lower poverty levels. And I was like, wait a minute, that doesn't seem realistic to me. But as we've progressed, we've seen those sort of what I would call affluent stereotypes saying this is what you should sort of achieve or attain or whatever. But then when I saw other shows that were much more realistic, I can't remember any of them off the top of my head, but they just seemed much more based in what I've encountered and seen. And remember, stereotypes are things that people perceive or they think they see, and then they just group everything together. So even as a young kid, I did that. I was like, wait a minute, that doesn't seem very white or very black. And even later when I did get to interact with Asians, I was like, really? All Asians are like that? Or they act that way? And, again, it becomes as we mentioned earlier, as you group and you label things. And we learn that as kids, I think, because that's how we learn. That's how we sort of adapt and interact. But mainstream media has not been kind to us, of all persons of color. I mean, not just blacks, Asians, but we're talking about Native Americans. We're talking about all indigenous populations. So I don't know how. I mean, other than education, as Dana, you were saying, we need to be more educated. There needs to be more studies, ethnic studies provided, not just in college. It always seemed like I had to go to college to get Asian ethnic studies or, Black American studies or whatever. Why aren't we starting this early? And that's, I think, a major issue. We need to have this, and I'm saying as early as kindergarten, because the minute we can see our differences, when a kid can see, oh, well, I'm more yellow, you're more black, or you're more brown, they should understand those differences and not be, first of all, judged by them or internalized. They need to be like embracing these differences. And it's like, oh, really? You're Korean American? Oh, you're Hispanic American? Oh, you're Native? I mean, there isn't that. And I think that we as a population, and of course, this goes into my other thing about representation, we need to have leaders who understand that and go, we've got to provide that at all levels of economic poverty. I mean, even, we know some of the most poorest schools have the worst educational systems in place, but we need to make sure that everyone has access to, Black history, Asian American history, Hispanic American history. And we need to get more people to write about it. That's the other thing. I mean, now I'm seeing stuff, everything from Watchmen to, Underground Railroad and everything, but we need more of that. And it's so, what's the word? Disheartening when we don't have that. So, sorry, that's my soapbox speech. I'll let someone else talk.
And just to add to that, and before turning to the ladies, and again, thank you all so very much. I think kind of the point for media studies, and particularly for children, I've had a chance to kind of work and build in that space, is that there's an opportunity of representation in that point as well. So once we are bringing kids into the space of media, I think if, like in 2018, there was a study done that there's more images of talking and speaking animals and kind of anamorphic creatures than they are of people of color in reading books and in cartoons and in those points of media. And if we think especially the younger generation now who are just indoctrinated in media in that sense, right? They're transmedia. Everything that they learn and develop is through the media. And even more so now when we're doing distance learning through, COVID protocols and things like that, we're oversaturating kids with media at this point, but then we're kind of giving them that high fructose version of that, which doesn't, have anything that's sustainable. So when they come out into the road and they come out into the world, I mean, they're already bringing in, they're already kind of starved for that type of education. And to your point, we don't have that in our traditional, U.S. school systems. And we have an issue with just the contemporary, history being told right, or just getting the news as it should be reported in our current setup. So I think it's absolutely important that not only we find that for the youth, but I think even as adults, we still need that reiteration of of authenticity and story in our media as well. So it's definitely a point that we need to kind of work on from there.
Yes. Do any of the ladies want to speak on that?
Sure. I just want to say a little bit. This is Latoya. Hi, everybody. Apologies for my tardiness. I absolutely support everything that's been said so far by Dedrin and Christian. I'm always coming, or not always, but from a professional standpoint, in my public health work, there's always studies out from representing different minority groups. And at the end of the day, comorbidities that we see or diseases that people get, some of them, whether they be, contagious diseases or infectious diseases, but especially the chronic diseases, we see that behind the success of a lot of different treatment plans or just a lot of healthcare period is education, right? That's at the bottom line of everything. Everyone that tends to fare better, even with those diseases, or even with, dealing with racism, whether it's in healthcare or in education or whatever, people who fare better all tend to have one thing in common, and that is education. And so I love, Christian, your point that you made earlier about how come we don't get to truly learn about indigenous cultures in the U.S. or about African Americans and until you get to undergrad, if that's a path that you choose to take. Like, I'm one of those people where I believe that college is not for everybody, and in certain instances, it's just absolutely so expensive, like astronomically expensive, that even if college is for someone, they may not have the financial opportunity or backing to be able to seek that education. But like you, I didn't really start to learn a lot about my culture in terms of the African American part of me until I got to undergrad, until I had to pay for school, right? As a young person, I did go to a private school, and and so it was, my parents had to pay for that, especially my mom, but there just wasn't a lot of education. So much of the education I got then was from me seeking out the library myself, not really because I was taught that it was acceptable to be African American. It was acceptable to be part Native American, part Hawaiian. You know what I mean? It wasn't acceptable, but those parts of me that were Irish and English and French, that was acceptable. And because my skin color was a little bit lighter than than some of my counterparts, that was more acceptable too. So I really got into, in terms of like code switching and in terms of having to deal with that and identity on a regular basis, I took a deep dive into that in college, because that's when I was exposed to the knowledge. So to the education. And so that made me start thinking about everything about health and how I take care of myself and some of the diseases that often run in our cultures. That made me think about the things that I'm naturally drawn to too, the things that I was told made me weird, such as liking comics or cosplay, or even liking science and math as a woman of color. I wasn't supposed to like that. I shouldn't be a doctor. I shouldn't be a lawyer. I should be a nurse or a teacher. There are certain even gender roles that I'm expected to fill in addition to my race and ethnicity, right? And the ethnicity of my family. So with that, all that being said, I think it's a great point. Education, number one, is everything. Education about everything is everything. I think it's really interesting that how in the United States and our culture and some other cultures around the country, how math is taught here, physics is taught here, biological sciences is taught here, English is somewhere back here, and so are the arts. But really, when you think about all of life, they are all intertwined. So when we start segmenting things, including people, right? That's when we start having fragmented information. And that's when that information for our children and even for adults, as Dedrin was saying, kind of gets fragmented as well. And so then we start seeing people siloed here and here and here based on our stereotypes or what people think our roles are supposed to be in society, based on negative stereotypes mostly. So I do think education is so important, and it should be more holistic and sort of complete, even adding the spiritual component, because many of us come from these spiritual or somewhat spiritual backgrounds, but we are not encouraged in American society to honor those. And if we do so, we shouldn't honor it publicly. And if we do, we got to be over here at a certain event in the corner to be able to openly honor those things. But in corporate America, you shall not, abide by those rules. And you know what I mean? So yes, education of all types on every level for all age groups is important, because it does speak to the code switching. I think the more educated you are, the more empowered you feel about yourself, because you've gone through these stages of self-discovery. So maybe code switching is something that you don't have to do based on your profession, or if your profession, the way the current society is set up, requires that, you're able to navigate a bit more seamlessly. But anyways, I could go on and on about this, but I think that's my contribution for right now.
Any of the other ladies, do you have any thoughts on the question?
So my experience is so different than everyone else's. I think I've been fortunate where I was raised and how I was raised and all of that. Being here in the District of Columbia, we were exposed to everything. My mom made sure we were exposed to everything. Raising us primarily by herself, though my dad is around. That whole single parent thing and everything. So I would say that what I saw, the Huxtables, when I saw the Cosby Show, it resonated with me, right? It resonated with, though I didn't have two parents in the household, that was possible. Like I knew people like that. I knew, we were middle class. We weren't by any means rich, but my mom made sure we had everything that we needed and some of what we wanted, right? So that was the line of thought. We were exposed to all sorts of things growing up. And as I raise my children within DCPS, there are schools that do teach all of these things you're talking about. So my perspective, I'm kind of blown away. Like the last time I sat on a panel, it was eye-opening for me that I've just had just this, I could say privileged or just blessed, life thus far. And, my kids have been exposed to things, Black History Month was more than just a month at their school. They did Native American stuff. They did Asian American. They did all sorts of things. So they learned, and it wasn't necessarily in the schools where the majority of the people look like us either, that they explored all of these different cultures and nationalities and wanting to educate. And it's all about education and all about what the parents do on the other end. My sister, it got deep into African culture and history and all of that. So she taught her children. So it's, the parents teach the children what it is to be and what it looks like and what it means. I think from a parental perspective, we cannot expect schools to do everything. Like we have to take the onus as parents to educate, or we have to take the onus as that aunt or uncle or whatever to educate the children, because school, they're not going to necessarily do it, or they're not going to teach the kids what you really want them to know. Right. So it sounds great that we get this whole democratic thing up and running and have them teach everything how we want it, but it's not realistic from that perspective. So I think that part of the cultural thing that we need to do is take a lot of that education on ourselves to say, this is what I want the youth to know. This is what I want them to understand and learn.
I have not to counter what Rosa was saying, but I feel that there are definitely limitations on what the parents can do to expose to a lot of this stuff. And again, Rosa, I think I've mentioned this before. You've been very fortunate. Unfortunately, for like my parents, they don't know anything about African American history, Asian American history. I mean, to this day, I had to explain to my father, not about slavery. He knew that, but just a lot of the emancipation stuff, a lot of the Chinese exclusion acts that has torn, so much family, what I would call struggles in this country. It has not been a free country for all. I mean, he didn't even realize what's happened to Native Americans. So to your point, I don't think parents, unless they, and again, generations change, right? My dad's he's now almost 80, right? So generations do change. I'm hoping, and I'm really praying that the parents of this generation are able to do that and have that sort of access. But it's not always easy. Case in point, I don't want to mention, but I have a friend he's got a teenager and I think the younger kid is probably 6 or 7, and they're of mixed race, and they don't even know what to teach their kids. He has no clue. And it bothers me that, he's not teaching it. And as you said, we can't rely on the schools, but in some sense we do. We do have to rely on the schools. And if they have the programs necessary to promote that diversity or promote some sort of education, and again, it doesn't need to be forced. What I mean by that is that within the libraries, or even within, what do they call it? It's been so long since I've been in elementary school, but like independent study, or what's it called? Classroom time, whatever it's called. I haven't taught in the young age. Whatever it is that they have that they can actually get access to. Let's say, oh, I want to watch, films that are, or documentaries that sort of go into these. We just don't have the access. They're not being, sort of given that sort of access. And again, you're right. I feel that parents have a huge, burden to do it, but we also need to have a community. They say it takes a village to raise a child, right?
Yes.
Well, some of these villages are very racist and very just one-sided. And I think those things need to change.
Yes.
Latoya, you're about to...
Absolutely. I'm about to burst over here. Listen, I understand that this is a diverse panel. And I understand that we all come from different backgrounds, right? And we live in different areas of the U.S. and have lived in other areas of around the country. But listen, if we're sending our kids to school every day, and our school systems are based on the tax dollars that we pay into them, then it would be nice, just putting it out there, if it could reflect the demographic that it serves, right? If the education could reflect the demographic that it serves. Now that's like the pie in the sky, right? I do believe that we are capable of getting there. We see schools that do have different programs that can teach our kids from a young age, but those schools are far and few between. And if they were not successful, if they were not effective in raising a generation of well-rounded and informed students, then in my opinion, there would not be such an attack on those programs in terms of funding, right? How funding is allocated through different school systems throughout the country. So everywhere does not look like DC, unfortunately. If it did, our country would be in a much different position, and we probably wouldn't even have to have a conversation about code switching, whether it's about adults or kids. However, like Rosa, I respect you, and I respect where you come from, and I respect your story too, and your children's story as well. And I think it's wonderful that you all have had that experience, but that is not by far the general consensus for most of the United States. If it were not so, then we would not have to have this discussion. I wish I grew up in a school where the history books started beyond, or before I should say, slavery. Every year, when kids start history, especially in elementary, in terms of African Americans, it starts with slavery. Every year, when it's time to talk about the Pilgrims, okay? That's the only thing that we get about Native Americans, and often those tribes are not even named, right? They're not even appropriately named. And every year, nobody wants to talk about Hawaii unless we're talking about it becoming the last state. And nobody wants to talk about the royal family that they used to have, that I'm actually a direct bloodline descendant of. Nobody wants to talk about that, right? But hey, it was nice that my family was able to teach me about that. It was real. I feel privileged about that my grandma was able to teach me that before I passed away. But I shouldn't have to rely on my grandma and my mom all the time if I'm spending 8 hours a day in school, if I'm paying to go to a private school on top of that. And then when I go to undergrad, it's like, or let me back up. Before I even went to undergrad, I actually had a problem with the way history was being taught in school in sixth grade. Right now, kind of going back to what Christian said about personality types, I'm definitely an extrovert. I don't remember the letters, the Myers-Briggs letters, but I'm definitely an extrovert. As a child, I was an introvert. So an introvert in a world where going to a private school, I was most of the time one of two, maybe African Americans in a class of 30 every single year from kindergarten until about 10th grade. And so when I started, exploring things for myself, like looking at my family tree, which most of us, especially of African American heritage, we cannot trace back our roots. So I could only start with the thing that I knew, which is the Asian part of me and the Native American part of me, right? But even then, in sixth grade, I distinctly remember, even as an introvert, having verbal arguments with the teacher in my school, because in his opinion, when we were talking about slavery, he was teaching it the correct way because that's what the curriculum told him to teach. In my opinion, he was not. it was almost as if slavery was the African Americans only started, their history in the United States only started, you know, when the first slave ship arrived. And I was like, I swear I read in the library that wasn't true. This is in 6th grade, y'all. So we kept arguing. I never got sent to the office. I was that kid that was just always on point. I got all A's and everything. And my principal was like, Latoya, why are you here? Like, you're never here. What's going on? Is there something going on at home? And I was like, no, look at this history book, because what I'm reading here is not what I read in my library book, right? And so, or in the library books. And so he was like, you know what, the principal and his wife were the owners of the school. And he said, you know what, I'm going to talk to my wife about this. So a few days later, they called my mom in because I was still going at it. I was like, listen, this whole unit is wrong. And if I were to teach it, this is what I would teach. I literally came up with a lesson plan for him. And so whenever he would go up over a section, I would raise my hand and be like, okay, but this is another perspective. So as a result of that, I actually got won the case, if you will, and got to choose the history book for the entire school, which was K through 12 at the same time. So what I did was they handed me a big, huge, I don't know, I guess like compilation of different history books from different manufacturers at the time. And so I had to go home. I took it upon myself too, to go home and study each one of these to be able to say, okay, which one aligns with what I've been taught as a child? Yes, from my mother, but more so from the place that I spend the most time at, which is school, right? And so, yes, I successfully was able to do that. But then that's what lit the fire under me. From that point on, I was like, okay, I'm up here changing curriculums. What else can I do to make people culturally aware, to make myself more culturally aware? Because going to a private school, my mom was working 3 jobs to send me and my brother. We lived in the projects. So no, we were not rich. My mom would try to come home every day to try to help us with our homework. Yes, so she could sign off our assignment sheets. And I still have no clue how she did this, how she was able to sleep and still help us with our homework every night. But there just wasn't that extra time, especially with the amount of homework that we had, to be able to teach us. Now, everybody doesn't have my story either. Everybody didn't have to come home with hours of homework, because that's just the school that I went to. That was their style. Especially nowadays, a lot of kids don't even have homework. It's just do homework in class, in session. And if you do have homework, it's only a little bit. But there's still so many different directions that parents are put in, that I do put some of the onus of teaching about cultural competency and things and learning about your own ethnicity. I do put some of that on parents, but some of that I do have to put on the school system, because that is what they are paid to do, right? Mm-hmm. So again, I can go on and on about this, but this is a topic I'm very passionate about. And although I don't have my own children in my spare time, I do take my niece and nephews aside and try to give them little nuggets to where I'm not overwhelming them, but seeing where their interest is piqued and then trying to feed that part of them a little bit more as they grow. And in addition to that, I do a lot. Well, I just recently moved to Maryland, but prior to COVID, when I did live in Atlanta, I did a ton of work like this around the city, not only for young people, but also people our age. So if I'm going to be somebody that says, oh yeah, we should be responsible for teaching these kids, even though I've not been blessed with my own, I'm still taking the initiative outside of my jobs. These are not paid gigs. It's all volunteer work, to make sure that information is out there and accessible for all ages, all races, all religions too, and people of any sexual orientation.
And just to go off the back of what Latoya said, there's so much surrounding, and there's so much to, unpack when it comes to cultural competency, the education system, and who is being served by what, So when I think of I'm just listening to what everybody's saying, because I'm much like Rosa. I see things I'm always, like I said, I'm Native Hawaiian, I'm Kanaka Maoli, so I'm always looking at everything from the outside looking in. I don't belong to other communities, and I don't say other disrespectfully. I'm saying I don't come from a binary community. So my lens and my perspective is so different, because I feel like, and I said this the last time, that a lot of the stuff that we are taught in Western society comes from institutions of white supremacy. I don't know how else to see it, but that's what it is, from the education that we receive to how we connect to each other, how we talk in corporate America, whether you want to call it code switching or not, which for me, code switching, like I said, it's one of those things where I have to say that it is a negative word that has been imposed on Black, Brown, and Native peoples to make us criminals to not being white enough or not feeding into the institutions of white supremacy. And so when I come back to the education piece that Latoya was talking about, when I think about education in Hawaii alone, you know, a lot of the stuff that is taught there serves the people who live there. But I have to play devil's advocate, because with the Polynesian people and the oceanic populations that are dwindling down and becoming part of the diaspora, who are we servicing now? We're servicing a lot of white people who have moved to Hawaii, who aren't appreciative. I'm not saying all white people, but I'm saying there's a lot of white people who aren't appreciative of the culture. They're not appreciative of where they are. It's like this elitism, you know, I deserve to be here. You deserve to treat me how I need to be. And that's not fair. You know, there's generations of young people, generations of older people who people don't even know that Olelo Hawaii was like a language that we weren't even allowed to speak. My grandparents weren't allowed to speak it. They weren't even allowed to learn it. Their grandparents weren't even allowed to speak it out loud, because if they were caught under provisional law in Hawaii, they would be jailed or killed.
Yes.
And so that's a lot of history that, you know, a lot of people don't learn about, like Hawaii being the 50th state. Depends on who you ask. Because for a lot of people, we're not a state, you know, and I think I said this last time, we're illegally occupied by the American military industrial complex. So that's a whole different perspective. But I say all that to say, when we service children in the younger generations in Hawaii, I think what we're doing is we're preparing them to be, or preparing us to be, a generation that is no longer dying, right? So even with mixed Hawaiians or Hawaiians of multiracial ethnicities, because that's what many of us are now, it's this appreciation of who we are as a people and what we are trying to do to preserve who we are. And so outside of Pearl Harbor, like Latoya said, you know, it's different times of the year that you learn. Every year you learn the same thing. But in Hawaii, you learn more than just Pearl Harbor. You know, you do learn different things. If you go to different schools, like Hawaiian institutions of education, you learn certain, you know, you have to take Olelo Hawaii, you learn Hawaiian history, you learn how to chant, you learn how to respect, you learn religious practices and traditions, like Latoya was saying. I remember in 10th grade in my Olelo Hawaii class, we had to chant to go into the classroom. And basically that was asking for permission to go into somewhere that we respected. Not only did we respect our kumu, our teacher, but just the place of going into learning some, you know, Hawaiian, the language and the traditions, and something that we would carry on. And so servicing that population, we are very lucky as Kanaka Maoli and allies, or whoever decides to take that class, to be like, yes, I do come from this community. However, outside of Hawaii, we'll never get that. Never. We will never get that. And so I think it's pretty important. Like, I think Christian said it. We need somebody who can write the stories that are from those communities. You know, and let me be the first to tell you, I intend on writing those stories. So, but yeah, I mean, I'm like Latoya, I can go on and on and on all day about this, you know, like Rosa, I come from a different perspective. So yeah, it's just hard for me sometimes to like kind of relate to everything that everybody's talking about, because I am one of those people who looks at everything from the outside looking in. And it's hard for me to not look at stuff as an institution of white supremacy, even to the way that we are taught to think.
Yes.
I think one of the things that was said here that I want to touch on was just self-advocacy. And what I heard Latoya say she was very passionate about is she advocated for herself. And there's nothing wrong with that. So if she was taught at a young age that if you didn't think something was right, you're going to question what's going on around you, and she was supported in that. So part of my thing about parents teaching and all of this, it's a level of self-advocacy as well. We can't get folks to out that they don't have it. There's a library there. I mean, and again, my perspective is DC. There are public libraries you can go to and get books and read and teach yourself and all of that. Yes, the schools do owe a lot, but if we're not advocating for ourselves, if you're not sitting on the school board, if you're not going to the school board meetings to talk about and push curriculum, because that's who they are. They are the parents. They are the people that go and advocate for what they want to see in the school system. So homework has gone away because parents said, my kid is too busy with their extracurricular activities to do all of this work at home. I leave work at work, so school should be left at school and they shouldn't have homework. And what happens? It goes away. So those of us who knew that growing up and spend hours studying and all of that, you don't necessarily see that with your children because they, the parents in the community that service the community, have said that that's not what they wanted. So self-advocacy is huge. It's something that you have to do in order to see more things that you want to see. People that want to see those things have to start talking about it. So they have to start speaking up about it. They have to say, this is what we want. This is what we want to see in our communities.
That just goes back to representation. Like I said, we don't have enough representation. Here we are electing officials, whether they be school board, whether they be, state or governors or senators, but we're not doing that. And we're not letting them know these are the things that we're advocating for. They're only listening, obviously during an election year, they only care about making sure that they win, but they don't understand that once they have one, that the people who put them there we have needs. And what really gets me, and again, I see it more in the corporate culture. What I mean by that is, let's face it, I don't know who you guys all work for, but understanding from our last conversation, whether it be government, whether it be private sector, they're saying, oh, it's Black History Month. Oh, it's Asian American Heritage Month. Oh, it's Hispanic Heritage Month. And it's just a checkbox a lot of times for them. They're not really thinking about the actual impact behind it. And that's what bothered me. But then again, I am somewhat, I guess, a relief is a better word for it. When I just walked into Barnes & Noble, what was it, the beginning of this month, they have an Asian American history section. You walk in and they're like, there's a Black Lives Matter section. So corporate America, whether it's about the dollar or whether it's about their image or reputation, at least they're trying to do things and provide access. So that a parent, I'm not a parent, unfortunately, or fortunately, either way you look at it. I ended up very happy that my nephew, I can go, hey, come over here, check out this section. Because I don't know what you're being taught in school, but you need to understand Black Lives Matter. You need to understand Asian history, Native American history, Hawaiian history. I'm hoping more companies will do that. Besides just having the checkbox, oh, it's Asian History Month, it's Black History Month, it's Hispanic History Month. There needs to be more. And I think we all agree. I think all of us can agree. Not just the self-advocacy, but being able to do more. And also, as LaToya said, let's push it. We need to be questioning. You said that we don't question enough. I mean, that's what's wrong with this younger generation. They don't question. They just absorb. They just consume because they're watching TikTok videos. They're watching Instagram. They're watching YouTube. I'm not saying, and I don't want to make a generalization that all kids are like that, but I'm just saying it seems that this generation is just absorbing. It's just consuming. And they're not being like LaToya and questioning. We need to make sure we are questioning more. Not just the kids, but even us as adults and parents, we need to question.
So we have to get involved. Somebody asked the question of how do you speak this into existence? And it's about getting involved.
I agree.
So, when I wanted something not even wanting something different at my children's schools, but understanding that the parents are the ones that make things happen. I was on the PTA. I was doing all sorts of stuff at the schools, because if we don't get involved, when we can't see what we want to see. I was in a management class with about 5 other people from my company. It was about a 6-month class on accelerated Black management or whatever. And they were like, oh, representation in the company. We don't see enough, VPs that look like us, blah, blah. And I said, wait a minute. How many of you aspire to be a VP? And they just all looked at me. Well, I don't. I said, so if you don't aspire to do it, no one's aspiring to do it. How do you expect to see VPs that look like you? If you don't want to take the lead, if you don't want to be that school board representative, if you don't want to do whatever, how do you expect to see these things happen? It's easy to say, oh, we're going to put you in a position and then you do what we want you to do, versus go do what you want done. So that's always my thing. If I want to see change, I'm involved. I come to you with an issue and a solution, and I help you implement it. I'm not just going to come to you with an issue. So we have to get involved. We have to be integral part of the change.
But here's the only other issue. The issue is that a single reed can easily be broken. We need to make sure that we're combining.
Mm-hmm.
It can't just be you. Maybe you have a big enough voice and a big enough influence, but a lot of times there are communities and schools, the one voice gets drowned or the one voice gets dismissed. We need to have what I call a group or collaborative effort. And it doesn't happen enough. I mean, even with the current issues that we're having with BLM and stopping AAPI, hey, we're not collaborating enough. There are lots of single voices, but we're not. I mean, and again, if we're as what was said earlier, if we are trying to combat these systemic and these machines of white supremacy and white origin, we need to be working so much more together. So,
yep.
I think another way to get involved is definitely to make sure that we're voting at the local level. Growing up, I didn't see the importance of that until I became an adult. It's like in a lot of social studies classes, you learn the 3 branches of government and what they do, but it's like, if that's not your passion, because for me, politics and learning government and stuff like that, it just wasn't my passion. I was more into the sciences. So, I didn't pay much attention to it, like only enough to just pass the courses, right? But as I got older, I started seeing how me getting involved wasn't just, attending PTA meetings or just being involved in my family's life and then other children's lives in my community. It does have everything to do with voting and local government. There's so much push a lot of times to vote for the presidential election because that is the top elected official in our nation, right? But the ones who make the decision on the local level are the judges. They are, in some cases, they're the judges. In some cases, they're whoever the police chief is going to be or whoever monitors the money or deals with the funding for police. It is prosecutors even. So I think when we have more people that look like us in these various positions, even in the sciences, having more scientists of color, period, not just those of Asian or South Asian descent, right? When there's people like us and when there's diversity within the workplace and within the community, period, and within those people that represent us, then a lot of these issues that we're talking about are more likely, not guaranteed, but more likely to be addressed in a larger space. The more we see, I was like scrolling through my LinkedIn actually yesterday and looking at all the people that are graduating with a variety of degrees, whether they be PhDs or MDs or getting their master's degrees or bachelor's degrees. And what I thought was really interesting, at least through my particular feed, based on how the algorithm feeds me information, is that there were so many people of color that were becoming these attorneys, that were becoming these, are getting promoted to judgeship and so on and so forth, are becoming teachers, becoming professors and educators at all levels, becoming our next physicians. And I thought, how beautiful is this? Because the more people that we have, like, representation matters. I always say, use the hashtag representation matters on my Instagram page where I'm talking about superheroes. But representation, like that hashtag, can be used across so many different disciplines. So when we have people that look like us, who are raised with our variety of different backgrounds and different life experiences, religious experiences, then we see diversity in publications, right? And a lot of what we do in our society is based on data and information, no matter what group you're interested in, whether it be hobbies or professions, right? And so when you see more publications and more science by people that look like you, who understand the biases in different technology, whether it's AI or just different information that's pushed out, period, then those things are acknowledged. And once they're acknowledged, then that influences policy change. And when we have policy change, then our laws are changing at the local level and then at the federal levels as well. So I think really getting involved with voting, which is something that's really easy. More recently, they're trying to make it more difficult. But the whole thing is, if there wasn't something valuable about it, there'd be no reason to try to mess it up for the masses, especially for people of color. So definitely, I'm definitely encouraging, especially young people who voted a ton in the last election, at least in Georgia locally, and especially at the national level for the presidential election, just encouraging them, the students and the young people who are interested in the detailed parts of that, to yes, feed that part of you, because you will be able to package information in a way that I can understand. That maybe I don't understand all the legalese about the information, the money that's going or not going to our school system. Maybe I don't understand all the legalese about, what police are able to do versus what they're not able to do, what's funded and what's not funded. But maybe you do as a young person, and you ask those questions and then inform me. I'll come to you as the subject matter expert. And for me, I'm over here, I like science, I like public health. So when you have questions about COVID, or when you have questions about, proper way to hand wash, or any infectious disease outbreaks at the national and international level, you can ask me. So then that way, to Christian's point, if we're all operating in who we are, we contribute. Just that's one way that you can contribute. Just truly operate in who you are, even the things that you think make you weird, and that makes you sort of an expert in terms of your life on that topic. So when it is time to collaborate, or when there are opportunities to collaborate, you can do that too. So vote and be who you are. That's my two takeaways in terms of what you can do as individuals to make a difference.
Awesome. Now I'm gonna read one of the questions. It was posted a little earlier, but definitely wanted to answer a question that came from the audience. Do you all think this experience is American-centric or a specific educational system in the U.S.? I was born and raised in Canada, and we learn about indigenous tribes very early on in history classes and exchanged letters with pen pals across Africa. What are your thoughts on the question?
I definitely
think it is American.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I agree.
I think it's very
say. Yeah.
I'm with you. I'm with you. Go ahead, sis.
Definitely American centric. Definitely. I'm going to agree with Latoya 100%. Definitely American centric. Again, going back to what I think, I think that we shy away from understanding how colonialism has shaped this country and what it has done on drastic levels to incorporate all the things that we learn today, and how we learn and what we learn and how we act. And if we go back to talking about like code switching, just bringing it back there, I think that the experience in itself is definitely American centric. Like we just talked about not too long ago, you don't hear much about Native First Nations people. You don't hear much about Polynesian peoples. It's all about, the Pilgrims came over here and the Indians were nice and they wanted to invite them to this feast. And, in Hawaii, it's, the Hawaiians had these white people come and they wanted to invite them to this feast, when really they kept coming back to the feast and then ended up getting killed. But that's that's not talked about.
And why is it always involving food? Why is it always involving food?
But I just want to add that it is that the history that we are always touting, because first of all, this might sound unpatriotic, but it is. I'm a huge patriot of this country. I love this country, but we only show, or we only write in our history books, the great things that our imperialistic America has done.
Right.
We never talk about, and let's face it, anytime you're trying to grow, or anytime you're trying to sort of push forth an agenda, you don't talk about the dirty things that you've done, right? And they get swept under the rug. And if we look back at history, whether it be about the Native Americans, whether it be about the African Americans, the slavery, or even if we go to the Chinese that were brought here to build the railroads, right? There used to be, and this has been even documented in movies, there was a saying back then where it says, never a Chinaman's chance, right? Which means they used to light the fuses of the dynamite to go through the mountains. And sometimes the fuses were long, sometimes the fuses were short. If they were short, a dead Chinaman. That's what they were saying. Then move forward to the Japanese internment. What we did to the Japanese during the war. Again, it's a blip in most history books. It's not expanded on. What we did recently, I was asking a professor, a friend of mine, because I used to teach at the University of Maryland, do we talk about 9/11, not in the sense of what happened, but how we treated the Muslims and the Sikhs and the Indian South Asian population, right? I've been told it's not even in the books about that it's only focusing on the tragedy of what happened. Yes, it was a tragedy, but we also have repercussions from that tragedy that have not talked about, and that's sad. So now moving forward to BLM, I'm sorry, Latoya, BLM, and now Stop Asian API Hate, are those stories going to be brushed under the rug as well? We need to, and this is back to what I think all of us agree, we need to be writing those stories, whether they be books, films, literature, history, whatever, media, we need to be writing them because they're not getting written, right? Sorry, Latoya. I know you and I are very on the same level.
No, you get me excited, man. So the whole thing that you just talked about, there's actually a term for that. I know we do. There's actually a term for that. And I was like, educational moment for everybody. It's called heroification. It's when you take a character in history, and I think somebody in the comment talked about, we all know Christopher Columbus got lost, y'all. Like, he didn't even know where he was. But yeah, we have Columbus Day, right? So you take a character or an actual person that lived through history, and you kind of create this hero version or shero version. Mostly it's guys, though, white males in this country. It's a hero version of them. And then you only put that in the history books. So we've seen this done over time. So remember when I told you about the whole 6th grade story picking the history book thing? Once I got to undergrad, I took it, and this is so sad. I shouldn't even had to take an advanced English class to learn about this term. But there is a book. It actually is one of the books that in college that changed my life. It's older book by a guy named James Lowen. It's called Lies My Teachers Told Me. And basically it goes into, that's where I learned the term heroification from, right? Because I was like, what? Somebody was thinking like me this whole time, but I had to go to the advanced class where there was literally only 10 students that qualified for my class, but everybody else was in a large lecture room and they didn't get the same information. Okay, I see what's going on here, but I'm still going to learn and take this knowledge in. But I started looking at things from a different lens once I had that education or that information, and I started seeing how many things are fall under that heroification umbrella, not just in our history books, even in science textbooks that I was reading, creating heroes out of scientists that like for example, even if we talk about Thomas Edison, for example, him and the light bulb, it's always Thomas Edison, the light bulb. But no one ever talks about, and I apologize, I think it just slipped my mind, the young gentleman's name that helped him. But there was an African-American guy that was like sort of at apprentice level. And now I'm gonna have to go look at it, or if you're watching this, please Google it. But he was the one that actually came up with the idea for what we currently know as the light bulb, not Thomas Edison. But Thomas Edison was turned into a hero, though. as an inventor, right? And so we see this all the time. So Christian, I was so excited when you brought up that point right now. I was like, oh, yes, we can talk about heroification and talk about whoever, controls, who's ever in control or whoever has the most power holds the pen, right? And so if people are holding the pen, like at this point in 2020 in the United States, I think so many of us have pens right now with the advent and the use of the internet, the way that it is, and all these apps that have been developed like crazy over the past decade or two. So it's so nice that so many of us have the pen, but then comes the thing where anybody can write history, right? At this point. And so there's lots of false information out there too. So we want to be careful that things that we're getting, and as we're writing things, that we're not only creating great content with valid peer-reviewed sources, hopefully, but also that we're collaborating once again with people that are like-minded to really push the message out there. Because sometimes all it does take is one voice, but sometimes it takes one voice and then people listening that actually want to follow that voice, right? And so that voice can be in the form of information, in the form of actual history, so that we can erase the lies that our teachers told us.
I wanted to add in something to that conversation, which again, everyone has such great points to that. I wanted to think if I, in my times abroad, had to code switch when, not in a traditional Eurocentric standpoint. And I try to think to my time, I used to work for the American Chamber of Commerce in Beijing, and had a lot of business meetings in those same points. And I can think, to Chinese constituents that there was a point of code switching. And I think, because obviously going back to the initial point of, is this an American only, is this our educational only type of circumstance? I think it's absolutely, inherently built into here to the United States. But I think there is a resonance and reverberation of just global colonization throughout history that has a lot of that systemically built in. So there is that hierarchical culture that exists, between countries and continents and people of cultures that are very close together. I mean, I think, for a Eurocentric standpoint, if you've got somebody that speaks across multiple languages, multiple, cultures and spaces that can interact with each other, then I think it's much more like Rosa's, DC example, right? You've got a melting pot of people, culturally, economically, these people have been dealing with each other for centuries. But America, inherently, came in and was built on a premise of just homogenous Eurocentric, domination. So it was built on enslavement. It was built on persecution and exploitation, as as the founding timbers. So, and it was so much space, there wasn't anyone else really to interact with. And so I think, look, just kind of going back to that example, I can just think to delegates and things like this, there was a certain way I had to carry myself, because I can recall if I didn't, then it was either going to be code switched at, or I was going to be stereotyped. Because I was thinking of a time when we came in as delegates to an office and they saluted, it was three British gentlemen and myself, and they saluted those two. But when I came, they wanted to give me like the high five, right? It was just like, it was soul brother time when I showed up. And it was like, where did that come from? It was, and I have very basic, Chinese, just enough to kind of talk with them. But it was the idea of like where they got all their information from was from the internet, or was from government regulated television, which unfortunately was very stereotypical towards Black people. So their interaction with me was, if I didn't act stereotypical, I had to code switch and act like my British compatriots. Eventually it worked, right? It was just like, okay, I'm here for business. I'm not here to entertain y'all. But that's not because they were coming from a place of, a negative connotation to me. But it was, again, it was like, how do we perceive you? And it was an either or circumstance. I don't think that they could see me as my true authentic self. Part of that's language, part of that's culture. I think part of that was just simply circumstance, yes. Right? And so with that, I think that stuff still racism has its passport, right? Prejudice has its passport. It goes to different countries and it beats you there a lot of times when, we have to go to those spaces the same way that we look at it from an educational standpoint. I think geographically, there are pockets of that, but I think just like everything, it's got different flavors based on, you know, the historical context of how the powers that be or the storytellers or the people in those positions look to tell those same type of stories. And just lastly, you know, it's the same thing with, you know, political. As much as we don't want to look at race as, you know, as an artificial construct, you know, same as politics, right? Politics aren't a inherent or natural thing, but something in our mind, much like economics, that we build and generate, you know, these structures of ways to divide ourselves. And I think we know we've been saying it at this other point. The only way we can do is to be there and be in those spaces and be active.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, several of you brought up about how, in a way, we have to code switch based on the places that we go into, that we have to adjust our way of talking, acting, interacting with folks. How quickly can you get the feel for a place when you get in there and decide if it's a place that will or will not accept your authentic self?
I can do that quickly. I think I've had a lot of practice growing up in the projects, like I said, among mostly African Americans, and then going to school in a very white neighborhood. Definitely, I could do that. One thing before I get into that a little bit more that I did want to mention, I saw in their comments that someone mentioned Lewis Latimer. Just as an educational learning moment again, Lewis Latimer was the name of the gentleman who actually worked with Thomas Edison to invent what we now know as the incandescent or current light bulb, or most popular version of the light bulb that we're using right now. So thank you to the guest. I can't remember who said that. I just remember seeing it popped up and I was like, yes, it's Lewis Latimer. Yeah. So we learned about heroification and Lewis Latimer all at the same time today. But anyway, in terms of code switching, so I think that definitely my experience was very unique because I would go to school for 8 hours one day and be around literally almost all Caucasian, evangelical people for most of the day, and then I would come home and they were all Christian, and we did a lot of Christian things there. We even had like church literally every day. And then I would come home and then I would go to a Baptist Black church, you know, with the people in the community in which I lived. And so I started learning then how to code switch. Now the neighborhood or the community that I grew up in was definitely Black and white. There weren't a whole lot of people of Asian descent at all. So my grandma, who is Native Hawaiian, and then her one friend who's Guamanian, they were the only two Asians in our community who both had married men, and the African-American men in the service. And so that was like just eating their cooking was my way to connect to the Asian side of me, right? So then as I grow up and become professional and decide I wanted to go into the sciences, there was less African Americans and more Caucasian and more like South Asians, right? And so I was like, all right, how do I deal with this? Well, I learn about them, right? I learned about individuals. And I think me being an introvert, I was constantly taking in information, and me being sort of science and research minded, constantly doing what I say is collecting information about different personality types, about different cultures and personalities within those cultures and what's acceptable and what's not. There's so much curiosity and the wheels were turning a lot. And then at some point when I turned 21, I decided my wheels were turning so much that I just decided there was like all these thoughts and questions building up, and I just exploded into talking, and then I just never shut up. So there's that, right? But when I walk into these environments, though, I first worked in a lab where it was, I think there's only me and one other African American, and all the other staff, including all management, were Caucasian. And so I sort of drew on that experience as a young person, but then I had to adapt it to being an adult, right? And saying, okay, so what do adults talk about in these environments? And so I kept it very basic, very just, you know, let's only talk about work. I'm not talking about anything personal because I might be persecuted because I like trap music and y'all don't, right? Or I said I'm a Christian, but I still like trap music and y'all don't, whatever, right? So anyway, I guess continued to be a student of life, right? And learning these different environments, but walking in cautiously, right? And as I'm walking in cautiously, sort of reverting back to my younger self where I'm collecting information, and I'm just very quiet, usually for the first 3 months. And I'll speak to people and stuff, but I'm just like, okay, just taking on personalities, understanding the dynamic that I'm in. And then I'm like, okay, in this moment, most moments I will have to be just this professional code switched version of myself. But there are always certain individuals that I tend to be drawn to where I feel like, okay, well, we go out the break room, let me just let my guard down real quick. So going from a lab into federal government and learning the stigma, especially in public health, there's just not a lot of people at the federal level who are super accepting of African Americans in public health, especially African American males from my experience. And so I'm like, here I am being the representative for Black people again. So let me get it together, learn this culture here, learn about the fabric of this agency or this company, and then go from there. And then now at the point that I'm at working at the Office of the Surgeon General, I definitely have moments where I feel like in certain professional situations where if I'm talking to the Surgeon General or those that are around him, then I'm definitely going to code switch a bit more. And then when I leave my meetings or when I turn my laptop off, then I'll be like, whew, okay, all right, keep going. But I'm doing this not only for our nation, but also knowing that I'm being watched and critiqued in a way that most people in that environment are not. I'm actually the first person, the first civilian to be hired to my specific position ever in history. So there's a lot riding on this, but I understand that I personally am okay with that because people have paved a way for me. So I use code switching as one of my many tools to be able to pave the way for others coming behind me. Now, can I still be my authentic self and code switch? I absolutely believe that. And I think it's actually gotten me some of the promotions that I've had in the past because supervisors have shared that. They're like, you're able to get along well with others and still not afraid to question certain things if they're morally or ethically wrong. And you're strong in that. And so sometimes in terms of leadership, that's what we need. So I've been promoted a couple of times. This position, like I said, was created for someone like myself. So in some ways, yes, I walk into a room and I definitely go back to that younger self in me and read the room, understanding that I'm dealing with adults, obviously, and adults with different backgrounds than me, and that is okay. But where can I meet them at without compromising who I am? That's the question that I constantly ask myself.
So I have had very similar experiences to LaToya, but I also have had experiences in the government sector that last time Rosa talked about. Having been, like you said, LaToya, I've been in situations where I was the only Asian person amongst whites and Blacks. And I also was in sales for a big majority of my life. And sales, it doesn't matter your color. What it matters is results. Do you sell the most? And so typically I was very driven, even though like I said, originally I still am an introvert, but I call myself a situational extrovert. What situation I'm in, I tend to become much more extroverted. So in the sales world, I became a super extrovert and I sold like a banshee to be always number one. I don't know if that's my Asian upbringing or just my parents being, you got to be number one. I always wanted to be number one in sales. And that was a big portion of my life, a good 8, 9, well, even before that, since I told you I sold Cutco knives, I moved into retail, then I eventually got into automotive sales. And again, working with people, they say the best way to sell something, if you look at Carnegie or even Robbins, they say you have to be able to mimic the person that you're selling to, right? Mm-hmm. So I would need to switch to be if they're a soft-spoken person, I need to be a soft-spoken person. Yeah. If they're a loud or boisterous person, I have to be a loud and boisterous person. It depends on their personality. I have to sort of mimic their person. So code switching, I never knew I was doing it, but I learned it from sales. And then when I got into the government, I was at the State Department for 15 years, not as a government employee, but as a contractor. And you want to talk about code switching because of the various different groups of people that I had to interact with? First of all, I knew how to be a good old boy, a good old white boy, because most of my bosses in the State Department were all white. And they would say comments that I was almost borderline, holy, 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 holy. I cannot believe you just said that. And I'm Asian. Or there's a Black person in our group. And I'm like, did you not realize what you just said? And I wanted to call them out on it. But again, if I wanted to maintain a good relationship with the consultant group, because I didn't want my consultant boss going, Christian, did you cause trouble? Did you do something? I had to play the game almost. And then guess what? I left government and now I'm in the private sector. I work for a major cloud company. And again, I think I mentioned it the last time, I felt like I was in a weird environment where all these white people were patting each other on the back, saying, we did such a great job. And it's like participation trophy time. And I'm like, wait a minute, we just lost 50% of our attendance from day 1 to day 2, and you don't want to address the elephant in the room? And then later I get a complaint on me, oh, Christian's a troublemaker. Christian, and I'm like, I've been a team player from day 1. And so the code switching can be detrimental if you don't play the game. It can be beneficial. And LaToya, I've been there too. I've gotten promotions because I played that code switching game. But it amazes me that depending upon the environment or the industry that you're in, you're going to be evaluated differently. So again, for those of you who don't know, I mean, for especially younger generation that don't know about code switching, sometimes I did it inherently. I never knew what it was called. It just turned out. And then I had one friend go, isn't it tiring to code switch all day? And I'm like, no, because I'm doing it naturally. It's just coming out. Now, if I had to think about it, oh God, I've got to be this way tomorrow, or I've got to be that way the next day. Yeah, that could be tiring. But I'll tell you, one other thing that I just want to share, my mother had a major prejudice, even to the point that I think, she was somewhat racist towards African Americans. Because guess where she learned her perspectives? Boys in the Hood. What is it? These movies that were just all about the menace to society, right? And so when I went to Penn State on a scholarship, and I started dating an African American girl, and my mom was like, no way, this is not going to happen. Even though I was code switching up there because she introduced me to her family and also all of her friends. She was from Philly. In the projects, weren't the best area. And I would walk with her and people would all look at me like, what is an Asian boy doing in this south side of Philly? And why is he holding hands with an African American girl? And I'll never forget, I met her uncle, her great uncle, and he looks at me and he goes, are you Chinese or Japanese? And I go, I'm Korean. He's like, yeah, but is that Chinese or Japanese? And I'm like, you don't know the Korean War? No, he's like, well, I thought the Japanese owned you guys. And I'm like, you don't really know your history. So again, I had to code switch there. I didn't want to be mean or impolite. I had to be very careful because I didn't want him to think I was one of those Asians, right? So I think code switching sometimes becomes second nature, whether it's good or bad, depending upon the situation. And I think a lot of us do it inherently. I mean, like I said, it's instinctive. It doesn't like, oh, I got to turn my hat this way to be with this person. I got to turn it back to be that person. No, that's not how it works. I'm constantly just, and back to Dana's question, I don't assess a situation. I'm just in it. I mean, I grew up with B-boys and all of them were African American, right? So the B-boys, again, they have their own culture, their own slang. I immediately got into it because I was hanging out with them. It's not like, oh, I've got to be more B-boyish. That never passed my mind. It was just me being, I'm in my zone, I'm in my comfort zone with my friends who like to break dance. I'm going to be that way. I'll wear my hat to the back. I'll wear my baggy pants, whatever, my wide lace, shoes. Again, this is really dating me. But anyway, understand that I think that's the biggest message I think that I want to sort of convey is that, yes, there are negatives to code switching. There are positives to code switching. But it's not about, I guess it comes down to intention. It's not my intention to misrepresent myself. It's not my intention to not be genuine. Because all of those pieces are me because of all of my experiences, all of the things I've grown up with, all of the interactions I've had with other people. That is genuinely me. Whether you may say, oh, you're acting way too black or you're acting way too white. That's what other people perceive. But in reality, I'm being my truest self because I'm just doing it subconscious. I mean, subconsciously. It's just happening. So I hope that answers your question. So.
Anyone else, as we get close to the end of time, anyone else had any feedback on that question, that last question?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to, go ahead. I talked a lot. Go ahead.
You sure? Rosa,
Yeah,
did you want to
go
say
ahead.
something?
I'm always my authentic self. I mean, it's just how it kind of is, right? You walk into a room and it is what it is. I think in a professional settings, we just kind of assess the level of input that we may put into a meeting or something based on the audience there. But I'm always the same way. I just, you know.
I was going to say, Christian said something that I wanted to address because it's also something that's not talked about often when we talk about representation and code switching and all of that together, is the anti-Blackness in other communities of color, right? So I just wanted to acknowledge that, there is a lot of anti-Blackness in Asian communities. There's a lot of anti-Blackness in Hispanic communities. There's a lot of anti-Blackness in Polynesian communities and Oceanic communities, even though many of us are darker complected. And so it's that lack, again, it goes back to that lack of education and just knowing of other groups of people as stereotypes, and that's it, and not honoring or taking the time to learn, like Christian said, oh, are you Korean? Are you Japanese? Are you Chinese? And then, oh, you don't know the Korean War. You know what I mean? It's because we don't take the time to understand the experiences of the people who are not like us. And so I just wanted to voice that out, and to name that, there is a lot of anti-Blackness in a lot of these other communities of color.
I think that's a great. And I'll, I guess, conclude by saying that is sort of piggybacking off of what you said, which is something I've always been interested in sort of the civil rights movement and civil rights movements across the world. I know that's not everybody else's thing, but I just have always been interested in it from a really young age. And so one of the things that, has come back around full circle now that I'm definitely a seasoned adult is around the time when MLK and Malcolm X were assassinated, what were they doing? And even more specifically, what was Dr. King doing that might have pushed the button so much of others that the assassination wasn't just a talk over the telephone anymore at that time. It was something that was actualized. And one of the things that I look back in history and see going on around that time is not something that is really often talked about in history books or in just literature, period, although there are some books that are devoted to this. But I thought it was a really interesting point. One of the things that they were doing is actually gathering people from all different backgrounds. So it didn't matter if you were Native American or Polynesian, or if you were Caucasian or African American. One thing that they were, the two of them, and specifically Dr. King, was uniting people under was economics, because no matter what our skin color is and no matter what our race and ethnicity are or religion, we can all identify with economics. And so I was like, wow, that's really interesting. So how do we take from the past what is definitely some stuff written in history books and apply it to the future so that we can move forward? And my opinion is exactly what you're mentioning. There's so much anti-Blackness in different communities, but yet a lot of the communities that do code switch or do find themselves having to code switch are dealing with a lot of the same social issues, at least here in the United States. I can't speak for all other nations, but at least here in the US. And so I think in some cases, if we can unite on that, some beautiful things can be birthed from just sort of some of us being the ones to bridge those gaps and or allow ourselves to be a human bridge or a mental bridge, if you will, during COVID, to transfer that information and allow people to travel with us, and we kind of go back and forth with them in terms of communication. I think the younger generation, the millennials, and also Generation X has a really unique place in history. And And I think a lot of them are communicating about these issues more openly than, our parents' generations and our grandparents' generation. So hopefully one day code switching will be a thing of the past, or if we are using the term, the definition will be redefined as in these young people who are going to be our future leaders, saying, you know what, I know how to deal or communicate appropriately with the Asian community. I know how to communicate appropriately with the Muslim community as in terms of religion. I know how to communicate with my own self first, so that once I can see who I am truly, then I can see other people just a little bit more clearly. So I'm hoping that, I don't know, that everybody who's listening and watching and participated in the chat got a lot from this today. I think it was a really awesome discussion, and everybody's input is valuable. All of our experiences are valuable, and we are a reflection of not only the participants on this call, but our nation. So really just happy to be on this panel with such awesome people and engage with such incredible people in the chat.
Well, thank you so much for wrapping that up for us, Latoya. And thank all of our panelists for your time, your input, and your experiences being a part of this conversation. Even though I know Rosa was saying that she's always been her authentic self, you are a good part of it, that we show the variety that is here in this country. That I personally know some people that had that all-inclusive background, that they didn't have to learn to code switch. But then there's, of course, Latoya, myself, and Moana, being from, descendants with or being born in Hawaii, we had to learn to code switch once we came to the mainland, because you're looked differently, they treat you differently, they have their own ideas of colorism and think so much of what Hawaiians should look like, how Black people should look like, how Asian people should look like. And a lot of that is definitely changing that whole mindset, that we have to not only be the people to educate, but at the same time adapt, being in the continent, here in the continental United States stuff. So I thank everybody for your point of views, your experiences, and we're going to, of course, a lot of comments from the audience. So we thank everybody for your time, for joining us today. And we thank all of you for coming back a second time to continue this conversation. I know we're still only hitting the tip of the iceberg, but at least we got the conversations going. And we look forward to having you all back for future panels on other discussions that we will definitely have coming up, to continue these conversations going about these things. Because without these conversations, we'll continue having these issues within the communities and the places that we grow up in. As we mentioned, we want to make it better for the next generation, that we can keep a lot of these things from happening, or as history repeating itself over and over again. So once again, thank you everybody for joining us. Before we go off, can everybody please let any of our people that are watching or live or on the replay, how they can follow you or connect with you on social media? And we'll start with Christian.
Yeah, you guys can follow me on Instagram and on Facebook. I'm at my limit, but feel free to connect with me or message me. But it's XIANOH, like the old school Xmas, but it's XIANOH, so you can easily find me. One other thing I just want to say before, there's a couple other things that are coming for Asian Heritage Month. So if you want to find out about them, check me out on Instagram and on Facebook. And I love mentoring. So, and again, all colors, races, ethnicities. So if there's anything that I can help with the younger generation, that's a big passion for me as well. So that's me in a nutshell.
Okay, Rosa?
I can be reached on Facebook at Rosa Air Singletary, or on Instagram at Raising Scholar Athletes, all one word. So like Christian, my Facebook and Instagram are really kind of private, but I'm open to messages from people and things like that. I don't really post a lot, just about my family. But I do work out in the community. I support the high schools specifically. I do talks and things like that with the children, dealing in math and science as well. And I'm going to get back involved with the National Society of Black Engineers that has a local chapter here of alumni. So folks can reach out to me and we can have some conversations. I'm all about helping people with career development as well, you know, to talk about resume writing, how to get your foot in the door, what things you're looking for, and all things like that. So.
Okay. Dedrin.
Thank you, everybody. Yes, you can find me on Facebook under Dedrin Sneed and also under Instagram at Dedrin Sneed. Under Twitter, I'm at Green, Green with an E, co-create. And my work's under subsumelife.com and sorghumandspear.com for comic and other creative endeavors from there. Thank you so much.
I am Visha Pawahi Souza. You can find me on Twitter and Facebook at Pawahi or I think it's Pawahi Souza. Both I'm much like Rosa. My Facebook is a little bit more private. My Twitter is wide open. I am also www.thepolynesianresistor.com. It is my blog spot. So everything justice oriented and just my thoughts about Hawaii are all there.
And definitely for those we've seen a comment that want to know more about Hawaii, I would definitely recommend connecting with her or any of our guests that have that connection to Hawaii to get that better understanding of the culture and the history.
Thank you, Dana, Moana. Thank you, panelists.
And last but not least, I'm Latoya, but you can reach me about professional things on LinkedIn. You can find me under Latoya Simmons. That's Simmons is my last name. And in terms of Instagram, all I post on there is cosplay stuff. And for those of you who don't know, cosplay is one word that is actually a combination of two words, which is costume and play. So all that's on there is only cosplay stuff, but feel free to follow me at Royalty Cosplay. And that's all one word.
Thank you. But definitely from everybody on here, definitely connect. Definitely be on the lookout for additional content that we'll have. We're going to have additional panels on this Thursday. We're going to be talking about appropriation versus appreciation. So please tune in at 8:30 p.m. this Thursday. We'll also have, of course, our special guest at 7 p.m. So definitely tune in. Follow the Moana Nui Podcast, Facebook, Instagram, or the Twitch and YouTube channels, so you can keep abreast of everything that we will have going on, so you can watch any of these discussions or guests that we have live on Thursdays or any special days that we have. Once again, all of our panelists, thank you so much for your time, your thoughts, and all of your appreciation. And we thank you, everyone, for all of your assistance today, and continue researching, doing your due diligence, talking with people within the community, and learn and develop yourselves, and continue tuning in on the podcast to continue learning more. We thank everybody for your time, and have an amazing Tuesday.